Today we are talking about how Singapore grew its GDP per capita from $320 to $130,000 per capita within a span of 50 years, making it the second richest country when you're looking at GDP per capita. The story is even more interesting when you look at the fact that the country has been run for the most part by one dictator. But aren't dictators supposed to be terrible and just bad for a country? And if you think it must have been oil money, you are extremely wrong. Basically, there are only two countries that have ever gone from being a developing nation to a developed nation. One of them is Singapore. So let's get started.
This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. I spent a whole lifetime building this.
Are reading about us. But we cannot allow them to assume a role in Singapore.
Singapore is a small city which is also a state, a capital, and a country. It's basically everything. It is located on the southern tip of Malaysia and has one big island and 63 other smaller islands around it. Singapore is a former British colony. In 1819, the Britishers negotiated a treaty with the former king back then to set up a trading post on the island. Of course, in a very classic British fashion, you give them an inch and they'll take a mile. So somehow by 1867, the whole island was now a colonial property of the crown. Funny how that works. This was obviously followed by the classic mixture of racism and the colonial bullshit that follows any country getting colonized. All the economic benefits were reaped by the colonizer, meanwhile the natives struggled to even put food on the table or were working on really small menial jobs with little to no upwards mobility within the society. And of course, the natives were not happy being treated like second-class citizens within their own country. But the real turning point for this colony was World War II when Japan attacked Singapore and Britishers seemingly did little to nothing to save the people on the island. This was mainly due to two reasons. One, that Britishers just didn't give enough of a flying fajita about the people living on the island, and the second was the Britishers' cockiness. They thought the Japanese were not trained enough to take on Britishers. Of course, when Japan attacked the island, Britishers were no match to the well-lubricated and well-working Japanese war machine. And fast forward to the end of World War II, as Britishers are taking over Singapore, the perception of the natives had already changed. The 2 decades that followed World War II saw Singapore go from partial independence to full independence. And it was within these 2 decades that they elected someone by the name of Lee Kuan Yew, a very instrumental person in this video, as their prime minister. Finally, in the year 1963, Singapore received full independence from the Britishers.
Lee Kuan Yew wanted a federation between Malaya and Singapore. It made a lot of sense because Singapore had no natural resources.
Right off the bat, Singapore decided to have a little fling with Malaysia and join the Federation of Malaysia, much like United States of America. But within 2 years, both Malaysia and Singapore knew that this relationship is just not going to work. As they were breaking up, the Malaysian president of the time gave a very heartfelt speech saying anyone watching this video should hit the subscribe button because it helps the poor channel. That's exactly what he'd said, and this is a fact. Yeah, so hit the subscribe button. Anyhow, on August 9th, 1965, Singapore was once again independent, and this time they were independent from the Malaysian Federation rather than the Britishers. Tiny little country, which is practically the size of New York, had a lot of issues to fix if it was going to have a future. At the time of its independence, most of the 3 million people who inhabited Singapore were unemployed. 2/3 of the people lived in slums. And all of this while Singapore lacked any natural resources, proper sanitation, proper infrastructure, and even a proper supply of water for its citizens. Of course, after a century of British occupation, this was literally bound to happen. At this point, Lee Kuan Yew, our main character of the story, comes into action. Realizing that Singapore had practically no natural resources, he knew the country has to depend on its port system that already existed and attracting foreign investment. So how do you attract foreign investment? He started by setting up an OnlyFans account for Singapore. Lee knew exactly the answer to this question. Any multinational company trying to invest in your company looks for mainly 3 things. First, a steady government system that is free of corruption. Secondly, low corporate taxes. And finally, a safe country with a lot of stability, because they don't want to invest in a country which might down the road turn into a war-torn country.
That we wouldn't be here, we would not have made the economic progress if we had not intervened on very personal matters. Who your neighbor is, how you live, the noise you make, how you spit or where you spit, or what language you use.
In order to make all of this happen, Lee turned his government into an autocratic dictatorship. Basically, him as the prime minister would have all the power and the final say on all the matters. At this point, 98% of the times anyone turns into a dictator, the country literally takes a nosedive. In this case, things took off. With great power came great responsibility. He decided to make a bunch of changes. For example, if anyone was found selling drugs or conducting corrupt deals, there was no real jail sentence for you. You would just be killed. The death penalty was literally his favorite thing. Everything that could be punished would be punished with death penalty. That was his mojo. On the other hand, he suppressed all the unions within the country, and the few that remained were consolidated into one big union by the name of National Trade Union, which was then led by his own party, aka giving him full control over labor unions throughout the country. Oh, and if you are some political leader or someone who doesn't like the way he's working, too bad. He's going to come get you, put you behind bars without any real due process. At least he didn't kill you. All these draconian methods had made Singapore a very attractive place for foreign investment. Considering the fact that they had one of the best port systems in the world already established, things were about to take off. As foreign investment started pouring in, manufacturing sector literally took off. This gave Singapore double-digit growth figures throughout the years from 1965 to 1972. This was quickly bringing a lot of people out of poverty and taking them towards middle class. If anything, the nation was growing so fast, it was quickly heading towards something called middle income trap. A middle income trap is basically when a developing country goes through rapid industrialization and a very fast-paced growth, bringing a lot of people out of poverty into middle class section. This stagnation is typically caused by bad policy decisions. Guess what? Lee Kuan had them covered here as well. Lee had started investing in Singapore's educational system. By 1990s, Singapore was not just a manufacturing hub, it was actually a diversified economy. Singapore had its hands in many industries from pharmaceuticals to aerospace engineering. As to when Singapore turned into a developed country is somewhat debated, but by 1990s and the early 2000s, Singapore was basically a developed country. As far as Lee Kuan as a dictator is concerned, he did one of the most important things a lot of dictators fail to do. That is, step down from the throne. In 1990, Lee Kuan stepped down as the prime minister but kept playing an active role behind the scenes for another 14 years. He was the man who would choose the ministers who would lead different sections of the government. One of the things he has always admitted to is choosing the right people who would guide him and the country in the right direction. He was heavily criticized for being a bit authoritarian during his reign as the Prime Minister, especially when you compare Singapore to the freedoms we have here in Canada and America. Of course, it looks quite terrible. In his own words, he never cared about democracy. He had a vision and a mission, and he knew how to get it done, and that's what he did. This man and his vision, as controversial as it may be, is what brought Singapore from being one of the poorest countries in the world to the second richest country in the world. Singapore's method of sacrificing individual freedom in order to encourage business is highly controversial and debatable. Some consider his philosophy as ruthless and authoritarian, meanwhile some praise him for what he had done. Regardless of which side you're on, the effectiveness of his methods are undeniable. He said he's going to take Singapore to the top, and he did. If you've watched this video this far, thank you very much. Please do share this video with friends and family. You can check out this video about how China is not the strategic giant that we are forced to believe that it is. Or you may check out this video about Democratic Republic of Congo, the richest country which has the poorest people. Anyways, I'll see you next week. Peace, bye.